I think the Fed is done for this year. I mean, we think the Fed could be on hold all the way until late 2020. So I think you will hear more of what we've been hearing over the last couple of weeks. But we're also seeing other central banks follow suit. Like the ECB announced policies a month earlier than expected and took down the inflation and the growth forecast. So we're getting a message from the central bankers globally that they're concerned about financial stability, that they're patient, and that they're in no rush to necessarily raise rates, whether it is at the Fed or elsewhere. Emerging market central banks are giving the same message.
Is that warranted as much by the Fed as it is by the ECB? As you mentioned, the ECB downgraded a lot of their growth and inflation outlooks. The Fed hasn't really had to do that yet.
They haven't really downgraded the growth outlooks, but what we're seeing is subpar, a moderate deceleration of growth, that is actually across many different regions right now. So I think it is patient, it's data dependent, and there's been, I think, concern with the volatility we had in December on overall global financial stability conditions as well.
When you mention financial stability, that's often the Fed's euphemism for markets are getting too bubbly. I mean, when that's warranted, right? So they'll say, well, we're concerned about financial stability. So if we dial ahead and let's say it's the June meeting, the NASDAQ's at 8,500 or something like that, 10% up from here, and unemployment's back down to 3.8%. I mean, can you paint a scenario where the markets and the U.S. economy perform well enough by the end of this year that this story flips again?
I mean, certainly you can paint that story, but you could also paint the story of greater market volatility. And I think that's what the market is debating right now. Has the Fed moved into risk management mode? And are we also seeing more of a deceleration than we had thought? There's also just the wait and see on what happens on trade tensions as well. So it's going to be data dependent. That's what we've seen. But we do see that right now the growth surprises have been more on the downside in the U.S. and elsewhere. And Europe has taken theirs down. So there's a question on whether the ECB really is going to hold through 2020.
Isn't all this priced in? The Fed pause, the easing elsewhere?
Well, when we look at the U.S. equity markets, we're only at about 30 to 35% of the positioning that we were at the peak. So we're still seeing relatively solid earnings growth. We're seeing certain sectors that lag, like the energy sector. So there are opportunities out there, but you don't have the type of positioning that we had at the end of 2018.
On the topic of the US-China trade talks, what's your latest expectation, both as to whether we get a deal soon and if it's makes a meaningful difference to the U.S. economy?
So the U.S. Delegation is going back to China. Chinese delegation should be coming in April. So I still think that on certain trade issues that you will see some type of agreement come through in the April-May timeframe. But it's really the non-trade issues, the question of whether this is more of a technology war than a trade war, that I think will be unresolved. But on specifically the issue of buying more U.S. goods by the Chinese, I think progress has been made there, and the discussions have made some progress over the last few months.
So, Joyce, you're here with Girls anchoring the closing bell. I know you've been doing a lot of research lately on female representation on boards, in companies, and in finance. What's your bottom line?
Well, we're seeing two areas where there's been quite a bit of progress, slow but steady progress in achieving gender balance. One is corporate board representation, where the numbers are now up to 22% of corporate boards have gender representation from women. Also, California has become the first state to mandate this. We're seeing less progress in the C-suite. You look at the Congress, though, you have a record number of women who were elected in the last election. So now 24% of the Congress is female. So there's slow but steady progress, particularly on the boards and on women in Congress, that I think is sort of a watershed year for women in 2018. After Hillary Clinton's loss, you had many more women running for office than had been the case previously.
Looking at your report, it points out that Europe is ahead of the curve a little bit compared to the US on this. What's that down to? Have they done anything different that the US needs to replicate, or are they just a couple of years ahead?
Well, they have many more government mandates in place, and it has been embedded in the guidelines. So in the US, it's in many of the guidelines, but it's not mandated by the government. But we are seeing progress at the corporate board level, a level of awareness from shareholders as well, where I think companies have focused on this issue to a far greater extent this year.